Now we're going to discuss prepaid expenses. What are these prepaid expenses? Prepayments are sometimes called pre-collections. When we say prepaid expenses, we have paid the expense in advance. Binayaran natin yung expense, pero hindi pa naman natin nagagamit. Sabi ka, prepayment is the opposite of an accrued expense. Cash was already paid, but the expense was not yet incurred, or only a portion of the amount paid was used up as expense. Diba? Pag accrued expense, we already have incurred the expense, but we are about to pay it. We're still going to pay it. But when we say prepaid expenses, the expenses were paid in advance. However, the expense has not yet been incurred, or not all of the payments were used up. Therefore, there is a need for an adjusting entry. So what are the three concepts involved here? Gawa lang tayo na discussion. Okay, so we have prepaid expenses. Okay, what are the principles involved? Number 1, expense recognition principle. Number 2, asset recognition principle. Ayan. Ano ba sabi dito? There are three concepts involved. Expense recognition principle, the asset recognition principle, and of course, the accrual basis assumption. Ilagay lang natin siya. Accrual basis assumption. So again, expense recognition principle is involved because we have to recognize the proper amount of the expense. How about asset recognition principle? We have to recognize the proper amount of asset. And accrual basis of assumption, we must always remember when is the expense incurred, or when do we recognize expense. So, hindi ibig sabihin na binayaran natin in advance yung expense, lahat yun ay expense. Diba? Naalala nyo, expenses are recorded when it is incurred. So, regardless, whether we have paid in advance the entire amount related to the expense, it does not mean that the entire amount should remain as expense at the end of the reporting period. We have to adjust accordingly in order to show the proper amount of expense that was really incurred. Again, expense recognition principle, asset recognition principle, and accrual basis of assumption. Naisip nyo, bakit expense lang apat may asset? Asset because if the payment was not used, or if the payment for the expense was not fully used, then we have to recognize an asset. Asset kasi meron pa tayong magagamit in the future. Remember, what is an asset? An asset is a property owned or controlled by the company or entity which has the probability of bringing an economic inflow to the entity. So, may economic inflow tayo doon sa payment in advance. Why? Because we will still be able to use it in the future. So, for all the prepayments which has not yet been used up, that is considered as an asset. Now, question, bakit ba kasi nagkakaroon ng prepayment? Bakit ba may prepayment? Kasi, ba't ba nagbabayad in advance? Nagbabayad in advance kasi either it is required by the contract or agreement between two parties, or nagbabayad in advance and nire-record din in advance yung prepaid expenses as expenses kasi the entity thinks that it is easier for them to record it such way. For example, yung mga maliliit na entities, o di kaya kapag yung expense na yung related expense ay ine-expect din ni entity na mauubos o magagamit sa buong taon or sa buong reporting period, ang ginagawa nila, nire-record na nilang lahat as expense yung prepayment. Mamaya na lang natin i-discuss yun kapag expense method pala. Pero, ang gusto kong sabihin ay, bakit ba nag-advance payment ang isang entity? Sometimes, it is required by the agreements, what I've said a while ago, or it's convenient for them, that has been their usual routine for the entity. Wala namang masama doon na mag-buy in advance, di ba? Kaya lang, what we should do is that we have to prepare adjusting entries in order to reflect in our books the proper amounts of assets and expenses that should be shown in the financial statement. So, what is an accounting problem here in prepaid expenses if there would be no adjusting journal entry? Well, generally, there would be either understatement of expense or overstatement of expense, o di kaya understatement of asset or overstatement of asset, and understatement of equity or overstatement of equity, and understatement of ayun, so yun lang naman pala. Sige, isa-isahin natin. Bakit may or? Bakit hindi ka sure, ma'am? Hindi naman sa hindi ako sure. Dalawa kasi ang method. I-discuss natin yung dalawang methods. Pero depende kasi yung effect nga sa ginagamit nating method. Hindi pareho ang effect sa financial statement kapag ang ginamit ay expense method at pag ang ginamit naman ay asset method. That's why we have to know. So, later natin malalaman kung ano yung mga accounting problems. Unahin muna natin i-discuss yung methods. Now, let's go to expense method. Bakit expense method? This is the usual method used by the entities. Expense. Anong ginagawa? Pag nagbayad daw sila in advance, ine-record nila as expense. Pero, expense ba lahat ng yun? Baka naman hindi nagamit lahat yung binayad in advance. So, kung hindi nagamit lahat or hindi na-use up lahat, ano ibig sabihin nun? Meron pa tayong asset. Okay. Kaya, dito, ano sabi? If no adjustment is made, the expense for the period will be overstated and the related asset will be understated. A while ago, we have discussed that in expense method, the advance payment was entirely debited to an expense account. So, discuss natin dito. Pakita natin yung entry. Pag ang gamit natin ay expense method, the initial entry is kopyahin ko yung ginawa natin kanina. Diba nag-discuss tayo? Ganito na lang pa, no? So, we have two methods. I-recap natin, gamitin natin yung example kanina. We have two methods. We have asset method and we also have expense method. So, pag asset method, the entire expense was debited to the asset. So, debit, initial entry is debit Asset, credit, cash, or accounts payable. Pero pag expense method, ang initial entry ay debit to expense, credit, cash, or accounts payable. Palitan natin ito para hindi nakakita. Bayan ko na nga lang. Entry. Ayan. Method muna tayo. So, expense method. Yan. Pag expense method, ano ulit yung initial entry? Sundan na lang natin yung nasa book kasi yun yung munang diniscuss. Expense method. Initial entry. Again, all the expense was debited to expense. All the prepayments were debited to an expense. So, debit, expense, credit, cash, or accounts payable. Yan. Yan ang initial entry. Ngayon, in-expense natin lahat, di ba? Paano kung hindi lahat ng expense ay nagamit? What if may natira doon sa expense? Hindi nabayaran lahat. Ano ba example? Yung supplies. Supplies expense. Kunwari, supplies yan. Nagbayad, bumili tayo ng supplies worth 10,000 pesos. Nirecord natin siya as expense. Kasi sabi natin, magagamit ko naman lahat ng supplies na to within the year. So, anong sense na i-asset ko pa siya? Expense ko na agad para hindi na ako mag-adjust at the end of the period. But, at the end of the reporting period, may natira na supplies. So, ibig sabihin, hindi lahat ng expense, hindi lahat ng supplies ay expense. Hindi tama na lahat ay nasa expense. May natira eh. Dapat may asset. Kaya anong dapat adjusting journal entry mo? Pag expense method, debit, i-recognize mo yung natira. Debit, asset, or prepaid, expense. And then credit, the expense. Bakit credit expense? O debit, i-discuss muna natin bakit debit. Debit kasi we have to recognize, di ba? Naalala niyo yung principle kanina? Asset recognition principle. We have to recognize the amount of asset pertaining to the prepayment. If there is a remaining amount not used up, then we have to recognize the asset. Kaya debit, asset. Credit, expense. Bakit credit expense? Because we have to reduce the expense which was originally or initially recorded. Since not all of the expense initially recorded were really expensed, then we have to reduce an amount equivalent to the remaining asset. Yan dapat ang adjusting journal entry. Now, what is the effect if no adjusting journal entry is recorded? Anong nangyayari kung hindi tayo nakapag-adjust? Number 1, what will happen to the expense? The expense is overstated. Number 2, since the expense is overstated, the net income or profit is understated. Kasi, una muna, expense is overstated because nilagay mo lahat sa expense. Pero hindi naman pala lahat expense may natira. Ibig sabihin, sobra yung expense na ni-record mo. Pag sobra yung expense na ni-record mo, kulang ang net income mo. Malaki yung expense mo eh. Bumaba ang net income mo. And pag bumaba ang net income, ano mangyayari sa equity? Equity is understated. And aside from that, ano pa? Akala mo expense lahat, may asset ka pa pala, may natira eh. So what will happen to the asset if no adjusting journal entry will be recorded? Asset is understated. So remember this. This might come out in the exam. What is the effect if no adjusting journal entry is recorded? Always remember this. You have to know that. Okay? So, malinaw ba yung expense method? Malinaw ba? Yan. Kailangan ganito muna, mamaya na tayo mag-problems para mas naiintindihan natin, para malaman muna natin yung basic. So, again, initial entry, pag sinabi mo expense method, all the prepayments were initially recorded as an expense. So, at the end of the period, adjust ka. Kung hindi naman pala lahat na gamit, hindi lahat expense, what will happen? You have to recognize an asset. So, debit asset, credit, expense. Hindi ka na mag-credit ng cash or accounts payable. Kasi, once ka lang naman magbabayad. Sa unang beses ka lang magbabayad. Kaya sa adjusting journal entry, ang credit mo ay expense. No, ang tip kapag expense method ang ginagamit, ang unang ginamit, number 1, para malaman mo kung anong journal entry, okay, to determine the debit side or the credit side of the journal entry, adjusting journal entry, you should ask yourself these questions. Number 1, para sa debit side, para alam mo kung ano yung i-debit mo, tanong mo yung sarili mo, how much is the asset? Or how much is the remaining asset? Remaining. Or how much is the asset? Yan. Magkabaliktaran sila. Tandaan niyo yan, class, ha? Pag expense method ang ginamit, baliktad. Pag nag-adjusting journal entry ka, ang tatanungin mo, ilan yung asset? Yun ang debit side. Kaya tignan mo, adjusting journal entry, debit, asset. So, kung supplies yan, sinabi, supplies were purchased on October 1, 2020. The 50,000 supplies were initially recorded as an expense. At the end of the period, the remaining asset is 25,000 pesos. The remaining supplies is 25,000 pesos. What is the debit side of the journal entry? Or what is the adjusting journal entry? The debit, tanongin mo agad sarili mo, uy, expense method siya. Ano ay kabaliktaran nun? Asset. So, debit, asset. Debit 25,000 pesos. Prepaid, supplies. Debit, supplies, 25,000 pesos. And then credit, syempre magkapareho yung amount ng debit at saka credit. Ang i-credit mo na agad, yung kapartner niya na expense. Diba? So, debit, asset, credit, expense, 25,000 pesos. Hindi ka na masyado nag-isip. Isa lang ang inisip mo. Ilan ang natirang asset? Kuha mo na agad yung buong AJE mo. Buong adjusting journal entry mo. Debit, asset, credit, expense. Pero kung hindi naman given, hindi naman sinabi, this amount is the remaining asset at the end of the period. Minsan hindi kasi sinasabi yun. Paano mo naman malalaman kung anong adjusting journal entry mo? E di itanong mo kung ilan yung hindi pa na-expense or itanong mo sa sarili mo kung ilan yung tunay na expense. Number 2, determine the amount of real expense. And then, credit the amount not expensed. Ayan, medyo nakakalito siya, ano. So, di ba lahat in-expense mo initially. You debited expense initially. Now, for you to be able to adjust, isipin mo, ilan nga ba talaga dapat ang expense? Kung initially na-record mo 50,000 pesos expense, pero ang sabi, only 5,000 were used. Only 5,000 supplies were used. So, ano ibig sabihin nun? 5,000 lang ang expense mo. Ayun, determine the real amount of expense. 5,000 lang pala ang expense mo eh. So, ilan lang dapat mo ibawas from the initial recording of your expense? 45,000 pesos. So, that will be your credit. Credit, 45,000 pesos. Kasi, ang tunay mo na expense dapat ay 5,000 pesos. Pero dahil initially ni-record mo 50,000 pesos, ilan ang ibabawas mo sa 50,000 pesos para maging 5,000 na lang talaga ang expense? 45,000 pesos. So again, kung hindi given, kung ilan yung remaining asset, kung alam mo kasi kung ilan yung remaining asset, pag sinabi, madali na lang ang adjusting journal entry mo. Debit, asset, credit, expense. Hindi mo naiisipin yung expense side. Pero kung ang given, sinabi lang na this amount was used up or this is the real expense, edi ang gawin mo para malaman mo kung anong adjusting journal entry mo, determine the amount of the real expense, and then you credit the amount not expensed para ang lumabas at the end of the period, ang maging ending balance na expense mo ay yung actual amount of expense. How about asset method? Doon na tayo sa asset method. Para dire-diretso tayo mamaya. Initial entry. What is this asset method? Ganun, parang ganun din sa expense method. Except that, initially, the entire prepayment was recorded as an asset. So, anong initial entry niya? Okay. Anong initial entry natin dito? Debit, asset, or tinatawag nilang prepaid expense. And then, credit, cash, or accounts payable. Now, what is the adjusting journal entry? Kung initially ni-record lahat as asset or prepaid expense, baka naman kasi lahat hindi na asset. Saan mangyari? Prepaid expense. Nagbayad tayo in advance para sa expense natin. So, asset mo yun kasi advance payment eh. Hindi mo pa nagagamit. Pero at the end of the period, kung hindi mo pa nagagamit lahat ng yun or nauubos ang lahat ng yun, hindi na siya asset. Hindi na totoo na lahat ng nirecord mong una ay asset. Kailangan nating mag-adjust. We have to recognize what? We have to recognize the expense. Kaya anong adjusting journal entry? Kailangan nating ma-recognize ilan doon sa prepayment mo ang nagamit na. Ilan ang dapat na i-expense natin. So, the adjusting journal entry should be debit, expense, credit, asset, or prepaid asset, or prepaid expense. Pag prepaid expense, hindi expense yan ha, yan ay asset. Yung accrued expense naman, hindi expense yun, liability yun. Okay, tandaan nyo yun ha. So, anong adjusting journal entry? Adjusting journal entry would be debit expense, credit, asset. Bakit? Initially, you recorded everything of your prepayment as an asset. Now, at the end of the period, hindi naman lahat yun. At the end of the period, may portion doon na nagamit. Kaya hindi lahat yan asset pa rin. Expense na yung iba dyan. So, debit expense, credit, asset, or prepaid expense. Now, what is the effect if no adjusting journal entry will be recorded? What is the effect? Yan. What is is the effect if no adjusting journal entry is recorded? Diba, nilagay mo lahat as asset. Ano mangyayari pag hindi ka nag-record? Ano mangyayari sa asset mo? Pag hindi ka nag-record ng adjusting journal entry, asset is overstated. Number 2, asset is overstated because lahat asset hindi ka nag-adjust ng journal entry, hindi ka nag-adjusting journal entry. Kala mo lahat yung asset pero hindi. Hindi na asset yan, bawas na yung asset mo. Baka nga wala na ding natira. Number 2, understated si expense. Bakit understated si expense? Expense is understated because hindi natin na-record yung portion ng prepayment natin na nagamit na. So, understated si expense. Ano mangyayari sa net income or profit pag understated ang expense? Overstated. Bakit overstated? Because konti lang yung expense na na-record. Understated Hindi natin na-record lahat ng expense. Akala natin konti lang expense, kaya mataas ang net income or mataas ang profit. Overstated. And what will happen to the equity? The equity would then be overstated. Bakit overstated si equity? Akala natin marami tayong net income So, overstated si equity. Pero kung sana ni-record natin yung adjusting journal entry, hindi naman dapat yan overstated. Tama lang dapat. Okay? Now, what are the questions that you have to ask yourself in order to determine what is the proper debit or credit to the adjusting journal entry? Number 1, debit side or DR. Pag-asset method, kabaliktaran din. Asset method, di ba? Asset mo, unang ni-record lahat ng expense. So, ano yung tanong mo sa sarili mo? Ilan kaya ang expense? O yun, lagi, kabaliktaran. Pag asset method ang ginamit, you ask yourself, how much is the expense? How much is the expense? Pag natanong mo, nakuha mo kung ano yung expense or given sa problem, yan yung debit side. Huwag mo na isipin yung credit side. Basta alam mo na ang kapartner ng entry sa credit ay asset, alam mo na yun lang ang dapat na i-record at yung amount, same lang naman doon sa debit. So, kung alam mo na yung amount na i-debit mo sa expense, yun na rin ang amount na i-credit mo sa asset. So, yun lagi nyo tatanungin sa sarili nyo. Hanapin nyo agad kung given ba yung expense. Yun na yung adjusting journal entry, debit, expense, credit, asset. Kung hindi given. Kung hindi given yung expense, anong kailangan mong isipin? For your credit side, determine the amount of remaining asset. And credit or deduct the amount expense. Okay. So, kung hindi naman sinabi ko ilan yung expense, isipin mo, baka naman sinabi kung ilan yung remaining asset or baka malalaman natin kung ilan yung remaining asset. So, you determine the remaining asset and kung alam mo kung ilan na lang yung talagang asset, bawasan mo, alamin mo kung ilan yung dapat mong ibawas doon sa initial asset na nirecord mo. Para makuha mo yung actual asset, actual remaining asset. And that would be your credit side. Okay? So, pag ganun lagi, pagka prepaid expense at saka unearned income, mamaya i-discuss natin, isipin nyo lang yung kabaliktaran nila. just ask yourself, what is the opposite? If the expense method is used, then ask yourself, how much is the asset? O the debit asset, credit expense. Yun na yung adjusting journal entry mo. Pag asset method naman, ask yourself, how much is the expense? The debit expense, credit, asset, or prepaid expense. O, gawa tayong example. Example na usong-uso sa inyo is yung pag magdo-dorm kayo. Diba? Pag nag-dorm kayo, usually, sabihin natin na may mga may-ari ng dorm, nagre-require sila na payment in advance, 1 year. Kailan mo nag-start ang school year ninyo? July 2020 ba? August? August 2020. Okay. So, kung August 2020 nag-start ang school year ninyo, sabihin natin na you've paid in advance the rent for the dorm for 1 year. Example lang, kunwari, walang pandemic, di ba? Mag-dorm naman talaga kayo. So, let's say that Mr. X paid in advance the rent amounting to, sabihin natin ang 1 year rent mo ay kung 10,000 sa isang taon, sabihin natin 120,000 pesos on August 1, 2020. Question. On December 31, prepare adjusting journal entries. Question number 1, prepare adjusting journal entry. Question number 2, yan. So, this is the question. Mr. X paid in advance the rent for 1 year amounting to 120,000 pesos on August 1, 2020. So, nagbayad daw ng rent si Mr. X in advance for 1 whole year. And he made that payment on August 1, 2020. So, the question is, on December 31, 2020, prepare adjusting journal entry. Question number 2, how much is the remaining asset at the end of the year? Okay. Assuming hindi binigay kung anong klaseng method ang ginamit, then we have to use both methods. So, asset method muna tayo. Okay. Kung asset method ang ginamit, ano ang initial entry? So, sa exam nyo, baka tanungin kayo, what is the initial entry when the asset method was used? Baka tanungin kayo. Okay, baka tanungin lang kayo, dapat alam nyo. Initial entry is prepaid. Diba, pag sinabing asset method, the entire prepayment is debited to asset. So, prepaid rent. Yan. Prepaid rent. Debit prepaid rent amounting to 120,000 pesos. credit, cash. Sabi niya paid daw eh. So, let's assume cash was used to pay 120,000 pesos. Ayan. That is your entry on August 1, 2020. Now, on December 31, what is your adjusting journal entry? On December 31, 2020, your adjusting journal entry would be, ang tanong, di ba pag asset method, tanungin mo kung ano yung isipin mo kung ano yung kabaliktaran niya. Asset, edi expense. Ang tanong, ilan ang expense? Ano ba ang adjusting journal entry natin dito? Debit. Dapat memorize nyo na. Debit, expense. Bawasan natin kasi si expense. Bakit debit? Babawasan si expense. I mean, babawasan. Sorry. Bakit debit expense? We will recognize the expense from the prepayment. Kasi hindi lahat ng ito ay asset. Kung dumaan na ang panahon, nagamit mo na yung asset na yan. Nagamit mo na yung pinambayad mo dyan. Kung nagamit mo na ang pinambayad mo dyan, anong tawag mo doon? That is an expense. That is why we have to debit an expense. And what is our credit? The credit is prepaid rent or the asset.